Hi there, and welcome to the Educators Corner podcast, the show that brings you conversations with educators from all over the world. Conversations where we stay curious for a little bit longer about the issues, challenges, and opportunities which we are facing in our schools and in our communities. Today, we're going to get curious about curriculum redesign and innovation with Will Goldsmith, Headteacher of Bedales School in Hampshire, UK. Bedales School, along with Latymer Upper School, hit the headlines back in September 2023 as the schools that are ditching GCSEs in favour of their own qualifications. This clearly raised a lot of eyebrows and interest right across the educational world. And I think it does pose quite a number of significant questions for our schools. Perhaps most pertinently, the question of, are GCSEs still fit for purpose? So, welcome to the show, Will. Thank you for taking time out of your schedule to join us from Hampshire in the UK. How is your week shaping up?
I've got a great week in that it's the last week of term and it's a half week, so we break up on Wednesday lunchtime. And basically, I've just got multiple Christmas celebrations to get through and just lots of kind of festive cheer. So that's a nice place to be.
That sounds fantastic. The joys of headship. So let's get curious first of all about your school, Will, Bedales School.
Mm.
Can you tell us a little bit about its history and maybe what you think's unique or special about Bedales?
The Bedales was founded in 1893 by a man called John Badley and a group of sort of like-minded educationalists who were pushing back against the kind of status quo at the time, especially in kind of public school education. And by public in the UK context, I mean private school, confusingly. It's always great the way we in the UK we have weird terms which make no sense. But anyway, and yeah, he himself had been to Rugby School, a very well-known all boys public boarding school, and for him, while there were things that he benefited from in his education, he, like many other people at the time, were questioning the kind of factory model. They were questioning the kind of maybe that sense of overconfidence I think you found in the 19th century about the British way of life, the British political kind of hegemony around the world, and wanted something which maybe struck a better balance and recognized maybe a greater sense of humanity and also gave young people a greater sense of agency um, rather than them having to follow a very kind of authoritarian model. I think the final thing that was really interesting in terms of the founding was the deliberate decision to locate the school on a former farm. And actually, we continue to be a small holding to this day, not because we're an agricultural college, but because we, like John Badley, the founder, believe that it's really healthy for particularly young people to grow up with a strong sense of connection with the natural world. And I think, especially in 2024, that's something which has a real sense of urgency about it and is a really important part of, or should be a really important part of any young person's education. We were an early adopter of co-education in a boarding context. So there's only one other school in the UK which started co-education and boarding earlier than we did. Um, and then over the decades since our founding, we've been known for being a school that is constantly looking to push forward and progress things in terms of innovation to reflect the society as it is now that we're preparing our students for, rather than perhaps a society which no longer exists, or at least lots of bits of it no longer exist.
Can you maybe just give one example of how the daily experience of a Bedales student might be different in 2024 compared to a student in, let's say, another typical, there is such a thing, independent school in the UK?
Mm. So it's interesting how the UK, in contrast to its continental European neighbours and in contrast to North American schools, is a bit of an outlier when it comes to the kind of formality you see in education. This is less the case actually in international British schools. I think partly the climate means you're not necessarily going to shoehorn or teenagers into stuffy woolen blazers with piping and ties and things like that. So generally the dress code is a bit more relaxed, but still there is a uniform, and that's very much a legacy, I think, of the British Empire. Interestingly, if you're looking maybe for some of the roots there, that the map of uniform and correlating that with British Empire is an interesting overlay. So I think one thing you'd find, and it is superficial on one level, but I suppose it's more profound in another way, in that young people in this school can choose to wear within obviously reasonable parameters in terms of them having to wear clothes and having to wear shoes, and if they're doing sport or they're working on the farm, they wear a boiler suit and kind of proper protective footwear. But otherwise, they express themselves in the way that their parents are generally doing so within a work context. There might be some sort of mild variations between how they present at school and how they might be on the sofa at home, on a Saturday evening watching a film. But remember, being a boarding school, then on a Saturday evening we have boarders watching a film, and they'll be maybe in a onesie snuggling up, getting warm with the December wind. So that sense of self-expression superficially is also part of something which is more profound, which is about an education of self and an exploration of self.
So you've worked in, I think, 6 schools. Well, you've worked in, I think, 3 state schools and 3 independent schools. That's quite an interesting experience. But what attracted you to Bedales?
So my initial reason for kind of connecting with the school was essentially an intellectual one, in that I was the director of teaching and learning at Latymer Upper, and I and some colleagues had been looking very much at innovation in the curriculum, and we were looking at schools both in the UK and internationally who had perhaps moved away or just weren't ever teaching or devising a curriculum in the same way that we do it, especially for 14 to 16-year-olds. So at Latimer, we'd felt that for the cohort there, as with the cohort at Bedales, as it happened, that they were not well served by GCSEs, and there was a better alternative, we felt, out there. Uh, you do a little bit of research, and very quickly you come across a school like Bedales when you're looking at curriculum reform. And I found out that it was actually from 2005 that Bedales had started moving away from GCSEs. And interesting, actually, if you go back in the history books, Bedales, in the final uh, days of O levels before GCSEs were brought in, had actually moved away from the standard O level model. And had created, alongside schools like Clifton College, an alternative O level curriculum. It was still under the O level brand, but it was very much something devised by the schools themselves in a kind of consortium. So actually, ironically, the cycles of education have been round at least twice when it comes to curriculum reform for 14 to 16-year-olds. So I came on a research visit, wanting to learn more about the BACs, the Bedales Assessed Courses, and just wanted to see a school which had actually put its money where its mouth was, and had actually enacted curriculum reform in a meaningful way and at scale. And that was my initial connection. I wasn't looking to move out of London at that stage, and I certainly wasn't looking to work in a boarding school because I was very happy in the day school environment. But it was something which was really transformational when I came here. I had already the intellectual interest in the school and its values and its tradition of innovation. But when I came here and I met the people and I saw the setting and I saw the whole package, then it became an affair not only of the head, but an affair of the heart, in the fact that I just suddenly felt like I had come to a school which, more than anywhere else I'd ever been to, either working in or visiting, represented the kind of educational values that I hold dear. And particularly being guided by students who had an authenticity about them, balanced with a humility, which I had genuinely not seen in any other school I'd ever been to. Obviously, young people are young people, but an environment can shape particularly the way they will interact with visitors. And their interaction with me was extraordinary. And that wasn't just because of those two individuals. It is very much a culture here. And I have visitors who regularly, on a weekly basis, tell me that they have the same experience.
moving on to the curriculum redesign innovation that has attracted so much attention, both in the UK and across the world. Will, let's try and start with your vision for your curriculum at Bedales. How would you describe that?
So our vision is very much based, as you've indicated, on our traditions, and it's also very much based on a sense of achieving the right balance. One of the unhelpful things about the headlines we had in September 2023 was that newspaper headline writers tend to like to create kind of more drastic sounding things than they actually are. And certainly, this is very much an evolutionary process, which is very carefully calibrated over, in this case, decades, to move from a GCSE model to essentially a non-GCSE model with English and math qualifications, which happen to be, in this case, GCSE, because we're in the UK and it makes sense to use those national qualifications, seeing as we are here. And again, it's not about being contrarian. So we're actually kind of sort of halfway through a process which will culminate for current year 7, so in the summer of 2029, where they will be the first cohort to have moved fully down to the 2 GCSE model that we announced in September 2023. Now that kind of that careful progress towards that model is about making sure we get it right first time, but it's also about ensuring that we are doing the right thing for our students in our context. And this is one of the reasons why we sometimes are a little bit cautious about sharing off the peg the entirety of our BAC curriculum, because the whole point of what we're trying to say to people is that we advocate for more kind of localized, autonomous approaches to curriculum and teaching, based on the community that you're serving and the cohort of students who you have in your students. Now, we are an academically selected school and we only offer A levels. And so our focus is on ensuring that our curriculum for our 14 to 16-year-olds is a better pathway through to A level than the GCSEs, the General Certificate of Secondary Education, designed for the entire population of the UK, regardless of what their future aspirations are or where they arrive at the beginning of the Key Stage 4 curriculum at 14, where they've got to kind of academically and intellectually. For us, we know that our students, they don't have a choice. It's A level or nothing at sixth form, and therefore we can make that kind of streamlining decision in a way that we understand that other schools might not be able to do so.
Just to be clear, then, for listeners out there around the world who might not have come across your curriculum and the curriculum that's evolving at your school. So you're currently on a journey by 2029. So your current year 7s, when they take, if like GCSEs, or when they would be taking GCSEs in 2029, they'll only be doing 2 GCSEs, maths and English. And for the rest of their curriculum, they'll be doing Bedales Assessed Courses. Now, we'll come to Bedales Assessed Courses in a moment. But I think, first of all, yes, this is an evolution. This is not a drastic measure that you're suddenly taking. It's been evolving over a couple of decades. So why are you phasing out GCSEs in this evolutionary curriculum redesign?
Mm. So I think we'd started, the initial impetus had been particularly in the arts and the humanities, and that's where those are the subjects that have already moved over from GCSEs to Bedales Assessed Courses. Um, and that was something which again draws on a lot of our heritage here. But recently, when we kind of reviewed where we were as a school, and the strategy about the BACs and the GCSEs is one which is part of a much bigger 10-year strategy. But when we looked at the kind of horizons for the next 10 years, because it's a 10-year strategy, and I would recommend education leaders think in a 10-year framework. I know it's scary, and there's very much a sense that the latter 5 years of your 10-year plan are going to be quite provisional. But unless you set that kind of time frame, then you're limiting yourself in terms of what you can actually achieve, because sometimes you need longer to achieve healthy, sustained growth and change. And I suppose, for us, we looked particularly at what had happened with GCSEs, both in this country and internationally. And you see similar kind of processes happening in other school systems which don't do GCSEs, but that had prioritized across the world high stakes external assessment and particularly knowledge focused high stakes external assessments to the detriment of a balanced approach to assessment and curriculum content. And for us, we weren't seeing anything coming out of the English Department for Education which suggested that there was any appetite for reconsidering that. And even now, the pace of change within the state sector in England, particularly, will be very slow just because of the challenges it faces. And so for us, we looked at the sciences and the languages, which are still currently taught as GCSEs, and particularly the most recent reforms in languages, for example. If you know anything about language GCSEs and the domestic GCSE in England, then you'll know that it is particularly reductive and particularly driven by rote learning. And the reasons why this happens are understandable, but it's just we're in this arms race where every year you've got to drill your students more and for longer. You've got 3-year GCSE courses now, and even further down the school, you've got students essentially practicing GCSE type assessments in order to be able to do well in them because it's such an arms race and it's just ever more competitive. Now, in the state sector, that's particularly driven by the accountability sort of regime in terms of Ofsted, and this idea that everything in education has to be measurable is actually something which then means that the stuff which is more difficult to measure just doesn't get measured. So you look at some schools, and some of them don't even offer things like in the state sector they don't offer things like art or drama or music as GCSEs because they're just too subjective and they're too unreliable in terms of students getting high grades every single time. You've also got real problems in the sciences, especially for GCSE, in the step up to A level, where teachers in the autumn term of A level science courses in the first year of year 12, so the lower sixth, have to tell students that the things they learned at GCSE, some of them are wrong, and they have to unlearn them. And the only reason why they learnt them in that way and learnt them as those facts, which turn out to not be factually correct, is in order for them to be able to shoehorn themselves into an accountability assessment system. Now, that's absolutely crazy. And it's also a massive jump. And so you've got students making decisions about taking A-level sciences based on GCSEs, and then they turn up at the A-level and they're like, what on earth's going on here? I didn't recognize this. That's, I suppose, more of the background to kind of where we are and why we made those decisions.
One thing it seems to keep on coming back to is the type of learning which the current GCSEs assessment are taking the teachers and then the students towards, and a discontentment with that level, with a lot of that learning, and that you think that the learning that the students need for the workplace for their future could be better served by designing your own Bedales Assessed courses rather than the students following these GCSEs. And schools are ultimately about learning, and so you're actually focusing very much on the learning. And so I think what we'd really like to understand now, and if that summary does have some resonance with you and you're happy to work with that for a while, is so what is it about the Bedales Assessed courses which is going to enable your students to learn in a way that's going to be better than following a GCSE course?
One thing I suppose just to kind of frame this around is that I'm talking about my cohort, which is perhaps in the sort of the top third academically of a full cohort of young people. There is also the bottom third that you find teaching unions in the UK talk about. They talk about the forgotten third, which is the kind of the number of students, more or less, who don't get a pass grade at GCSE English and Maths when they're 16. In the way that those qualifications are currently constituted. And so there is a sense in which actually this is not just a question for our cohort, it's a question for lots of different young people, although for maybe different reasons. And in our desire to create something which is equal for everyone, actually we create this really kind of reductive middle way, which doesn't serve 2/3 of the population. And I suppose I do want to get that across, because obviously I'm talking about my context, but there are other contexts where this is relevant in different ways, but actually maybe even more acutely relevant. In terms of your question about how the learning is better, then one of the really challenging things about teaching a GCSE curriculum, and I mean, one thing I would say is it's not that we throw everything out that's in GCSEs. When we're formulating a new BAC, we look at what the current GCSE is, believe it or not, and we will take a lot of that from there because there's good stuff in there. And again, this kind of press narrative, it's kind of like ditch GCSEs, scrap GCSEs, hate GCSEs, awful, awful. That's just not helpful. You've got to move beyond the headlines and understand this is a more nuanced argument. Um, but fundamentally, the moment you have a high stakes assessment system, then you have to give your students time for them to prepare for that assessment type. We've calculated that by the time we get to the 2 GCSE model, we will have gained back more or less 2 terms worth of learning. You take out mock, you take out teaching to the test, and then you take out study leave and doing the exams. And remember that your average English GCSE student at 16 takes more than 30 hours worth of exams in a period of sort of 3 or 4 weeks in the summer of year 11. We gain back 2 terms worth of learning time by not having to do that. Now, that's an enormous amount. If you think about it as a 2-year GCSE course, if you're still doing 2-year GCSE courses, that's a third of time you're gaining back. And when you think about that as a percentage of a young person's life, that's enormous. Think about what we can do with that. So I suppose time is the first thing, really, which, on a very basic level, you're gaining back. The other thing is by giving much more ownership of teaching and learning back to the professionals, the teachers, the people who have a professional qualification in teaching and learning and assessment, then actually what you're doing is you're ensuring that the teacher is there to serve the students that they are teaching, rather than something to be dictated top down. Now, obviously, there have to be sort of calibrations, and there need to be checks and balances, but certainly the disempowerment of educators, especially in the UK system, partly because even in the independent sector, the exam system drives so much of that and controls so much of what happens in the classroom. But particularly in the state sector, the amount of centralized control that has happened, the amount of distrust from the Department of Education to teachers is something which is, I think, is a terrible thing. And certainly there is an excessive amount of political control over things like an assessment regime and the curriculum content. We saw this particularly in the Govian reforms, but it's not a purely political party political point. This is actually something which began way back in 1997, and this kind of desire to control more and more, to centralize more and more. I can understand it, but the cost is enormous. Now, I'm not one for pendulum swinging back the other extreme, but at the same time, there needs to be a recalibration. The great thing for me, having worked in both the state and the independent sector, being at Bedales, then I and my colleagues are able to exercise our professional judgment with a freedom that you don't find in other places.
Brings a lot more time into the curriculum to focus on higher order thinking, I guess, more genuine and authentic learning, giving autonomy to teachers. We know from the work of people like Daniel Pink that autonomy is a great motivator for our colleagues. And this idea of going back to this idea, I think, of maybe teachers being architects or designers of learning. I mean, that's how I entered the profession many decades ago, and it was quite a pressure for a young teacher to suddenly have to think about, when I went on teaching practice, I had to create all my own lessons, whether it was Key Stage 3 or Key Stage 4. And while that was a professional challenge, that was also a creative opportunity for me to explore lots of different ways in which I could work with the subject content and the group of students that I was in front of me. And I think, while I think assessment has always been quite a chore, or can be quite a chore for teachers, but one of the big creative parts of teaching is designing the learning. And if we've taken that away, and I think it sounds like we have in many contexts, certainly in the the English system, we've taken that autonomy and that creativity away from teachers. To be able to bring that back, that seems like a great gift that you can give to your colleagues.
Yeah.
So in terms of the Bedales courses, then, could you give us a bit of a flavour of let's just roll out some of the courses that you offer? I mean, because some of them are, I think people would recognise as part of the Key Stage 4 curriculum. Some of them sound a bit more novel or
Yes.
innovative.
So there's a mix, and again, this is the sense of balance that we have a BAc in English literature. Does that sound familiar? We have one in history, we have one in geography, and in art, and in music. But we also have one in music tech, which within an academic context you might find less. We have one in outdoor work, which is a kind of blend of heritage craft, permaculture, and sustainability. And we have one in digital game design, which is a blend of mathematical game theory, coding, and world creation and narrative and character. So there's a kind of a bit of my own subject, English lit, in there as well. So there's room both for things which we know work well and have a coherence intellectually to them, your English lits of the world. But then there's the scope where we feel it's necessary to bring in a different approach. We have that also in our global perspectives course, which has now actually become quite popular in GCSEs and A levels. Particularly, there's an A level now in global perspectives, and for us, it's great to be able to bring down some of those social sciences into Key Stage 4, which otherwise you tend not to be able to do. So there's a huge mix there. Then I think the other thing I would say is the kind of, to give you a flavour of what they look like. Each specific subject discipline will approach the learning in a way that fits that subject discipline best, and particularly the assessment as well as the curriculum will be there tailored to that particular subject discipline. So in English, for example, in English lit, again I'm talking with my subject, then we have high stakes essays which they write under time condition. But we do that alongside coursework and also vivas, so an oral assessment, a bit like this. In art, you'll have portfolios, you'll have project work, you will have artifacts as part of things which are quite recognisable and are not that dissimilar from some aspects of the GCSE curriculum, for example. There will, in our global perspectives course, there will be a real world aspect to exploring the real world, and particularly one which is rapidly changing at the moment. And so students will, have projects where they have to involve community voice, for example. They will be assessed on their ability to deliver some kind of social impact, or at least a proposal for a positive social impact. Alongside, again, other things which are more familiar in terms of written work and so on and so on. Depending on the subject, that will then determine what's the best way to assess in that area, not what's the easiest way to get a uniform measurement of young people numerically.
Okay.
And I suppose that's, and then the final thing as well is that you spread the assessment over the 2-year course rather than everything bottlenecking at the end. Although there is obviously a culminatory element to almost all of our BAC courses.
In terms of then, I guess, preparation for A level and beyond, how do your A level teachers, how do the universities that your students might apply for, or the workplaces that they apply to, what's the currency of BACs? How does an employer or your university know that a BAC from Bedales sort of aligns with some sort of national standard? How do you assign currency or value to it?
So in some ways, the whole point is not to give them a kind of standardized currency. That's the point. You don't need that when the exit ticket legally in this country is 18 from full-time education. They've got their standardized tests, the universities and the employers via A levels. They've got a couple of GCSEs at 16, which can be useful in terms of transference if the student wants to go to sixth form elsewhere. And also it's useful just in terms of core skills for employment. But that's all they need. They don't need any more. The only slight kind of wrinkle, which is something which we need reform, not just for BDales, but also just generally for young people, is that the UK university system operates on a post qualifications, a pre-qualification application model, which again makes us as a country an outlier, even more so than doing GCSEs in the way we do them. But when we talk to universities, and we've been doing BACs since 2005, and on the UCAS, so UCAS is the UK university system, on the drop-down menu for 14 to 16 qualifications, there is one of the options is BACs. So there's not some big hole there, but and we give them more information if they want. University admissions officers are now very used to these, because we've been doing them for some time. When we explain what we're doing, though, to maybe people who are new in the admissions department, then they may not be able to say this publicly, but when we have conversations with them, they are delighted that we are doing what we are doing. They are frustrated with actually what other schools are churning out in terms of the kind of skills that either are or are not being developed, because they can see what we're doing here is deliberately calibrated to what they're doing at their level. And so we are preparing students for the multimodal assessment types that you have in universities, in places like Bristol and Edinburgh, and even Oxford and Cambridge, who are maybe more limited in their assessment types. Do they do Vivas at Cambridge? Yes, they do. And there are calls even within those very traditional institutions for broadening the range of assessments in the 21st century, but for the same reasons that we talk about broadening the range of assessment. And so university admissions departments love what we do with our students, because it means that generally our students settle much better onto those courses. They have the skills to be able to deal with the range of assessment types they have. And also they are much more active in being critical thinkers and much more active participants in their own learning, because of what I talked about earlier in terms of that dialogue and that sense of relative agency that our students have in comparison to other students. When they arrive at university, they just hit the ground running. That is huge amounts of currency. Then for when they move beyond university, they've also got that really, really strong sense of self, that strong sense of creative, appropriate risk taking. They've got that sense of being really, really good at critical thinking, because they're encouraged to think critically and ask critical questions of us at every level. And yes, that sometimes takes a bit more time, but that's why we are deliberately a smaller community, because we want to make sure that we have enough time to be able to interact and for our students to interact with us.
It sounds like that even though you're on a journey to reduce the number of GCSEs your students are taking down to 2 in 2029, that at the moment, and it doesn't seem like you anticipate any disadvantage, if anything, it's the opposite for your students applying to universities beyond BDales. Now, the fact that the Bedales Assessed Courses are on the UCAS drop-down menu, I imagine that was some sort of journey to get to that point, and maybe there's a whole different podcast about how other schools could get to that point. But in a nutshell, are you able to explain, was that a difficult process to go through to get your BACs on the UCAS menu?
Would it be as easy in 2024 as it was in 2005? Maybe not, although I don't know. Certainly in terms of an appetite for it, I think universities, they love it. And it wasn't that difficult. Once we could explain to them what we were doing and why we were doing it, and how we were influenced by the university model. So, if you think about it, you don't have an Oxford degree in maths, which is created by Pearson. It's created by the maths department in Oxford University. It'll be it'll be externally moderated by someone from Warwick or Cambridge or Edinburgh or whatever, but that's how they run it, and they're trusted as professionals to do the right job. So they understood it and they understand it much better actually than the people who are overseeing secondary education sometimes. So it really isn't as difficult as it sounds. One stumbling block, maybe on a more systemic level, is the fact that universities currently use GCSEs as a filtering tool for the students who have lots of GCSEs. Now, in our case, and especially once we move to the 2 GCSE level, our students will essentially get put into the same bucket as any applicants from the Canadian system, where, and this is no coincidence, at 16, what external high stakes assessments do they do at 16 across the entirety of the country? They do a numeracy and a literacy qualification. Interestingly, which is all online, by the way. That's another conversation for another podcast. But that's all they need, because they're not leaving high school in Canada until they're 18. just in the way that our students aren't leaving secondary school until they're 18. Um, it would be helpful to recalibrate the university application system, but at the moment, that's the tail that's wagging the educational dog. And again, that's that's purely bureaucracy. That's not education. That's not actually a sensible way of doing anything. I mean, I'm sure how frustrating it is having to have conversations about predicted grades with students and families, and how divisive that can be between teachers who just want to do the best thing for the students, and then the system which requires them to try and work out what's going to happen with a crystal ball. And the variation not only in terms of student performance, but also the variation in the quality of marking. Again, you'll know about the number of appeals that we have to put in as head teachers every year, because marking isn't always accurate. So again, there are so many inaccuracies in the system that is a problem. But it doesn't hold back our students even now.
Okay, Will. Absolutely mind-boggling, really, in terms of curriculum innovation. I mean, I've been involved in curriculum innovation for a good 20 years or so, and I've never come across, I think, such a substantial shift at a school level in what you are doing at Bedales and what your colleagues are doing at Latymer Upper School.
Mm.
Um, so I guess the currency would be one fear that other schools might have if they completely are on board with the educational rationale, which I'm sure a lot of schools would be. They'd be worried about the currency beyond the school, let's say university. And I guess the other piece is around sort of stakeholder reaction.
Mm.
Students, parents, staff, governors, maybe reaction from beyond the school. Can you share a little bit about your experience of those different stakeholder groups and how they have reacted to this curriculum evolution?
Mm. I mean, it, you might want to talk to colleagues at Latymer Upper as well, because they've come from a different place. At Bedales, there is this culture of innovation, which has been there from the outset. And so, you know, the vast majority of people of all the different stakeholder groups you've mentioned welcomed it. I mean, some people even said, "I wish you could do this quicker," and I've had to say, "No, we're going to do it carefully because we don't want to, it has to be right first time." But there've been some people, and there's a spectrum with any change, even at a place like Bedales, where you have to listen to people, and you have to sometimes talk things through, and you have to sometimes explain things. And I think certainly, particularly for the first year group to come through, we've been spending more time with, especially with the parents, to ensure that they fully understand the rationale, that they're reassured that we're doing all the things we need to in terms of going carefully, and all the sort of checks and balances there to make sure we get it right the first time. Um, but other than that, then in our context, it's something which has been really positive. I mean, certainly, I can't speak too much for them, but I know that at Latimer actually, they were surprised by how little pushback they had from prospective parents when they did open days. And actually, for, I think the one person who raised any objections in one of the open days they had, I think this was last academic year, they maybe had 10 people who said they were there precisely because of what they were doing, which they considered to be better than the current model. And I think, if you ask parents up and down, certainly this country, they will all talk about how frustrated they are with what 14 to 16-year-olds have to go through in terms of GCSEs. Now, there is sometimes a sense of powerlessness, but I think there is a consensus that as they are currently constituted, and there'll be differences of opinion as to how much they need to be reconstituted. But fundamentally, as they are currently constituted, the system is not working and is not serving young people well enough. I mean, one of the really interesting things, if you're looking specifically at kind of data and when you're looking at statistics, we know there is something statistically proven called the maturity gap. And that's where at 16, and well, from about 14 till about 13, 14 till about 17 or so, uh, boys on average mature less quickly than girls. That's because puberty normally happens later with boys on average than it does with girls, although these are very broad averages. And you and I know again that things can happen at very different times. Now, that's not just about physical maturation. That's not just about, maybe boys on average maybe being a bit sillier than girls at a certain age. It actually is borne out also in assessment data. that boys statistically do less well at GCSE at 16 than girls do. And every year we kind of pull our hair out and, oh, what are we going to do about boys? Well, we've created a system which disadvantages them, knowingly so, and yet we do nothing about it. That, from my perspective, is something which is really unfair. It's really inequitable, and it is knowingly inequitable. All the evidence is there, and we totally agree with that. Now, some high stakes assessment okay at 16, but actually 18, by 18, we know statistically that gap has closed, and the attainment gap between boys and girls has largely evaporated. That, to us, feels like the equitable time to put young people through high stakes assessment. And we do believe in high stakes assessments. We know that with the right balance, at the right time, in the right way, they generate really good growth in young people. That is an important part of their development. They need to develop the resilience to deal with working under pressure. But 16 is a terrible time to do too much of that.
Are there any other key lessons, Will, in terms of so far on this journey that you think you'd like to share that would be valuable to share with other schools who are thinking of evolving their curriculum?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing is, particularly if you've got a school which is focusing on an academic set of outcomes, and particularly I think in the international world and in the independent school world, or in selective state schools, then you will find a parent body who are particularly attuned to success at high stakes assessment, and particularly looking for pathways into selective UK and international universities. Ultimately, I suppose if you could say, by getting rid of GCSEs and having a different curriculum, which is a better preparation for A level, you will see better outcomes at A level. Then that's a really easy sell to people maybe who are more transactional about kind of outcomes and currency. So that's the first thing to say. And remember that universities can't discriminate against a student where the school hasn't delivered GCSEs. So, if a student is applying to a UK university from Canada or America or France, or the Omani state system, where I don't know if they don't do GCSEs, then fundamentally the university can't say, well, you've not done GCSEs, or you've got really poor GCSEs, so we're not going to even put you through to selection. They don't
Mm.
do that. They just put them in an alternative kind of bucket, and so it could become a problem if half of the state sector and all of the independent sector in England moved away from it, because they would have to rethink the university application system. But that's all. And certainly at this stage, we're still talking about a tiny minority of students, and universities are really used to dealing with that. So I suppose I would really encourage students, schools that are nervous about this, to actually kind of take courage and realize that this is something which is designed to be exactly what their parents are looking for. Obviously, you've got to take people through the journey carefully, but I think particularly in the current market, but I think internationally and domestically with VAT for independent schools, parents are saying, well, what do I get that's different from the state sector? What do I get? What am I paying for? Well, you're paying for something you literally cannot find in the state sector, and you're finding something which will deliver a kind of education that you just don't find in other places. So, there is a USP element to this. The other thing I would say is you don't have to go down to the 2 GCSE model to bring in alternative curriculum for at least part of what your students are doing. So, you could, for example, have your students do 8 GCSEs, and then you do 1 or 2 of your own curriculum. And certainly, knowing what Latymer did, for 10 years they had a kind of global awareness interdisciplinary course where they'd taken one GCSE off, and then they just replaced it with this one interdisciplinary course, which drew a lot of the A-level subjects which weren't normally taught. Now that was really successful. It worked really, really well. And then it gave them a model of how to do that, and it gave them the confidence to move forward. I think if you stuck maybe at the kind of minority level of alternative courses to GCSEs, you could then, particularly in the current moment, find there'll be pressure to move back to a full range, just because a mixed economy like that can create tension. Although other schools have done it, but I know that there are other schools who moved away from things like English literature and history GCSE, but eventually moved back to it just because of that kind of centrifugal force. Um, if you're looking for advice, there's a really good campaign group which we're part of called Rethinking Assessment, and they have a subcommittee that works specifically on school-directed courses. It's called the School Directed Course Consortium, SDCC, and they have a lot of advice and case studies about how to do this in lots of different contexts, not just the kind of context that I work in.
Zooming out a bit now, I think the government's review of curriculum and assessment, I think that's just closed. There have been submissions been invited over the last couple of months. And I've seen from your website that you've submitted your thoughts to that review. So what would your best hope be?
My best hope would be that there would be an evolution, but a clear and categorical evolution towards a more balanced approach that would be underpinned by reframing education to a 14 to 19 modality rather than an 11 to 16 modality, in recognition of the fact that leaving age is no longer 16, but it's 18. Obviously, you have to account for sixth form colleges, but I think that's doable within that. It would be great if they could move to a post-qualifications application system for universities in the UK. I think that would unlock a lot of the problems, and certainly within the state sector, but also to some extent in the independent sector, that we move towards a more constructive accountability system, where it's about school improvement rather than punishing schools. I think if you could do all of that, which I think is reasonable, and there would be a time frame to that, then that would make me feel really, really positive about decisions made at policy level.
We've got to the bottom line it round, which is where we're looking for concise and to the point answers. One word is okay, but no more than one concise sentence. Will, are you ready for the bottom line it round?
Yes, I think so, although I'm feeling a bit nervous about this one.
You're ready to bottom line it. Okay.
Let's go for it.
Here we go. Question number one. What's the biggest leadership lesson that you keep on having to learn?
You can never listen enough.
Excellent. I really, really like that and can really relate to that. Question two, a key moment in your leadership journey that made you think or lead differently.
The moment I became acting head when I wasn't expecting to be a head teacher.
And what changed?
Realizing that I could be a head teacher and be happy doing that.
Okay, wow. That sounds like another podcast as well. And question three, what's your favorite way to unwind at the end of a busy day as head of Bedales?
This is an easy one, cooking.
Cooking.
It's a great way. Either at home with my loved ones, or sometimes, in a boarding school, we might have students round and we'll make a meal together in the kitchen. It's a great way of just getting an outcome very quickly.
And what's your signature dish currently, would you say?
My signature dish will always be influenced by my time living in Malaysia. When I went to Alice Smith School, another international school, which was heavily influenced by Chinese cuisine. There's a big Chinese community in Malaysia, and so I will always cook Asian food as my default.
Sounds great. Okay. Question four. Leadership is
Learning.
very profound and very succinct.
You wanted
And
one
finally,
word, so that's what you got.
absolutely, leadership is learning. Right. Yeah, I like that. Okay. And finally, Will, the purpose of education should be
To educate the head, the heart, and the hand.
excellent. That's absolutely brilliant, Will. Thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule towards the end of a long term to join us on the Education Corners podcast today. Your insights, your experiences, what you're going through there. I mean, there's not many school leaders are going through what you've been going through and what you are going through. And I think the courage that you are leading and how you're working with your community is really commendable. So thank you for sharing some of that with us today.
No, thank you very much, Kai. It doesn't feel like it's courageous, because it just feels, and it is driven by evidence, tells us that it's the right thing to do. But thank you very much for having me. I really appreciated being able to talk to you today.
Well, it's great, and our education systems do need people like you. We do need innovators. We need leaders, and we've been learning so much today. So thank you, and have a really restful break when that comes.
You too, Kai.
You've been listening to the Educator's Corner podcast. the show that brings you conversations with educators from all over the world, the podcast where we stay curious for just a little bit longer. The Educators Corner podcast is hosted by me, Kai Vasher, and produced by Stuart Pardoe, Zoe Snell and Marion James, and by BSM BSS Productions.